In this presentation, I'm going to address a couple of student questions with regarding the Gravity Lab project. And so Paul sent in this project. It's a really cool looking project right now. When I hit the play button, there's kind of stuff falling over the place, and there's some 3D models that he integrated into the scene. It's looking really cool. But he mentioned there were a couple of things going on. The first thing is the camera perspective was changing a little bit based on what his preview was telling him, and also that some of the physics might not be running as efficiently or as predictably as he expected. And so we'll take a look and see if we can't tweak a few things and get to the bottom of them. Now, ultimately, physics are going to run a little bit different depending on from machine to machine. So we might get different results, but there are a few things that jumped out. So the first thing I'm going to address is the camera aspect ratio. Right now, when we hit the play button, we kick over to the game tab and we get a preview based on our camera perspective, and that might change your it might shift a little bit from the preview to your camera perspective. I'll toggle the play button here and I'm back in my scene, and you can see that I have the camera selected, and this might give me a basic idea of what the scene looks like. Okay, but you can see that as I recompose my window, you can see that the camera is not necessarily recomposing itself. Okay, and that depends on some camera settings. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at the game tab. Now, I'm not going to hit the play button, I'll hit the play button for just a second, just to remind you that when we hit the play button or use Command or Control P, by default, the game tab gains focus. So our game tab has focus and our simulation is running. Just a quick reminder that any changes that we make while our simulation is running is going to snap back. So as an example, if I could find an object here to affect, if I move this ramp up a little bit, when I toggle the play button, it'll snap back down. When I toggle the play button, we also go back to the scene view. I can also click on the game view without hitting, or the game tab without hitting the play button or using Control or Command P to play our simulation. Now, our game is not running, but we're looking through the camera, and we can access a couple of different things when we're looking through our game view. What I'm most interested in looking at is our current aspect ratio. Okay, now this is actually tied to some of the properties of the camera, which we'll take a look at. But right now we're looking at the free aspect, looking through a free aspect. And so if we go up here right under the game tab, mine says free aspect, and I'll just click on this drop-down menu. We can actually change the aspect ratio that we're looking at. So we could look at a 4:3 or 3:4. We can set some things up, and you can see that kind of changes the aspect ratio of our current game. So we can choose the different aspect ratios, whether we're designing for a phone, a tablet device, or a television. We might want to change this aspect ratio, and then we can also set things not simply based on an aspect ratio, but a fixed pixel size. So you can see that we can view 16 by 10 or 16 by 9, but then we can scale with this slider, okay, which is going to give us different results, and we'll possibly get some artifacting and some strange anti-aliasing. But if I set this to say 1920 by 1080 or 1080p, you can see that we're at that aspect ratio. I'm looking at a 1 by, I have a pretty high resolution of my monitor, and if I zoom in to 2, we should get pretty accurate results, but I'll slide it back out to 1. But this is now 1080 pixels high by 980 pixels wide, and that will give me a different sense of what my game looks like. Now, in addition to jumping back and forth between scene and game view, we can get a more accurate estimation of what our game is going to look like if we split these panels. Now, there's a couple of different ways to do this. Much like a lot of the applications that we use, Unity is highly customizable. And so if I grab the game tab and I click and drag, you can see that I can snap the game tab into different locations, and I'll just snap this over to the right side. So basically what I'm aiming for is just the right edge of the screen, and now when I release it, now I'm looking at a split view. So I can see my scene and my game view side by side. In fact, if we were to look at the top right hand corner, there is a layout drop down menu, and we're looking at the default view right now. If I change from default view, I can look at 2x3 or 4x4, and these will kind of give me some crazy views. I'm going to suggest that we stay in the default view. However, we are going to start to customize our view a bit, and one of the immediate valuable kind of custom setups that we'll establish is by grabbing our game tab, and if we have the screen real estate, just kind of pulling it off to the right side here, changing to some sort of a fixed aspect ratio or a proportionate aspect ratio. At this point, what we can do is we can go find our camera, and as we move, we can move our camera around and get a better sense of what the composition of our game is going to be. Okay, now this is assuming that our camera is not going to move, and so now when I test or build my game, this will be the preview that I get. Now, when we build it, unless we set a few things behind the scenes, we're going to have some options, and we're going to have different aspect ratios that we can test this at, and so we still might get our camera, kind of doing some different things. So at this point, if you're targeting a desktop or targeting a very specific device, I would just determine an appropriate resolution. I think if you don't have a specific resolution in mind, I would shoot for like a 16:9 or 16:10, or just create a 1920 by 1080. So if you want to create your own presets, all you have to do is hit the plus button, and then you can decide whether you want an aspect ratio, so a proportion, or if you want a fixed resolution. And so we can look up the resolution off the top of my head. I'll choose like an iPad Air, which is, 2048 by 1536. I believe I got that right. And I'll say OK. And so now I have the proportion of a popular tablet. So if I'm designing for a tablet and that's my target device, I have this maximum resolution here. And this scale is telling me whether, depending on your screen resolution, how far zoomed in you are. So I would try to get that as close to 1 as possible, unless you have a really cramped screen. But there's my actual iPad resolution. So now I don't want to design with this setup here, but this will give me a really clear idea of composing the camera. If I save this layout, I could go to my layouts window, choose to save layout, and I could call this iPad Air layout. And so now I can go from my default setup here, okay, where I'm designing and doing everything that I need to do as I was doing before. So kind of playing around with some things. And then when I want to jump back in and evaluate this based on my iPad layout, I can just jump back over there. So just a few things to keep in mind when it comes to the camera and the screen changing, and there's some other things that we need to take into account. We'll take a deeper dive into this a little bit later, but it does tie into a couple of things when setting up the camera, and right now we just have a simple 1-to-1 width and height for the camera proportion, so it's going to adopt whatever this game view is. So it's kind of a flexible camera that will accommodate whatever our game aspect ratio is. Okay, so that was the first issue that I wanted to address. I'm going to, in the next presentation, we'll take a look at some of the physics issues that were popping up. There were two different issues. One is that there might be some inefficiency going on in terms of the physics running, and there was also an issue with trying to move some of these little catapult things that were set up. But we'll do that in the next presentation.